So we've sort of, in terms of our triangle, we've made our way halfway up, and now we're going to talk about the behaviours we do not love. Um, I have thrown up a few here. So throwing furniture. Well, started big with that one. Not completing class tasks, so that sort of not following through on what they're expected to do. Absconding, swearing, defiance, calling out, interrupting, being physically aggressive. Non-exhaustive list. I think we could probably sit here for the whole rest of our time together and just list behaviours we'd like to see less of. Where we'll go from here is talk first about non-disruptive behaviours, the disruptive behaviours. And for those non-disruptive behaviours, throwing it out, you've already mentioned one, so silly noises. That for me might count as a non-disruptive behaviour. Not that it, I think it has potential to become disruptive depending on the intensity, the frequency, all of that stuff. But in general, if it counts as attention seeking, that might be something that planned ignoring is appropriate for. In this way, the distinction is more based on whether it has the potential to be a harmful behaviour in terms of own safety and other safety as well, or it breaks a rule basically. So, which I mean, I guess hurting somebody else would be breaking a rule. So the big ones being, is this child being non-compliant, or is this child doing something that breaks a rule and puts their own safety, other people's safety at risk? And so disruptive behaviours, getting out of something, that would be sort of the more non-compliant stuff. Getting something that might be something like attention or something tangible from another kid, they might be aggressive or whatever. So I guess that's more the distinction between the disruptive and non-disruptive. I always try and make things as simple as possible for myself to think about, but then also working with parents, giving a basic thing. So I will often say things like, a child will only get a timeout from you for doing two things: for being non-compliant with your instructions or for breaking one of your house rules. And that's the only thing that they'll get a timeout about, because so many behaviours fall under being non-compliant or breaking like the rules or the house expectations, right? So that's sort of the way that I think about that. But it obviously covers a breadth of behaviour. And so I guess these are the things that we're going to speak about next. I will spend more time talking about planned ignoring than the other ones, because I think planned ignoring is something that you're already doing a lot of, and it can serve you so well, but it's also probably the hardest strategy to use. And so when we say planned or strategic ignoring, I think that's a really important place just to pause and think about what that actually means, because this is a very deliberate strategy. And sometimes some of the parents who I work with struggle with this one because it feels like they're letting their child get away with it, or that they're not doing anything. They're just, they're sitting back and allowing it to happen. And so it's almost having to reframe that perspective towards planned ignoring being this very strategic approach to behaviour management, this very deliberate and strategic removal of attention from a particular behaviour. And the types of behaviours where you would use planned ignoring for are those classic like attention-seeking behaviours. The behaviours where the function is to achieve some sort of reaction, attention, or whatever from another person, right? And I don't mean attention seeking in like a pejorative way, like they're doing it on purpose, they're getting attention. All of these behaviors are learned. I pull out, I tug on a shirt because I've learned that's a really good way to get whatever need I have met, right? And so what we would do for those types of behaviors is really strategically remove attention from a behavior. And it's thinking about your attention as this precious privilege, as precious as the iPad, and what types of behaviours earn special privileges and what types of behaviours don't deserve a special privilege. So it's almost thinking about attention in that way of this is, I was going to say this is a gift, this is a privilege that kids almost have to, earn with particular behaviours. And I don't mean that like sort of hard and fast rule. Obviously, we'll give attention to children, not just when they're, doing everything we want, but thinking about it in that way. And I think the thing that, because so many parents have tried ignoring, so many teachers do ignoring, and I think the point of difference in how I might teach planned ignoring is this idea of closing the loop. So we will often ignore a behavior. So something's happening, a kid's making a noise, calling out in class, tapping a pen, whatever it looks like, and we're ignoring that. We've strategically removed our attention from that behavior. It does not deserve our behavior. It has not earned the precious privilege of our attention. And so the lesson learned there for that child may be that making a silly noise doesn't get my teacher to look at me, to talk to me, to interact with me. That might be the lesson learned, right? What I try and help parents or coach parents to do, and increasingly do this with teachers as well, is to close the loop on that planned ignoring. To be almost, and it's very demanding, so I say it's like one of the hardest strategies, is to be monitoring the point at which that behavior stops or reduces in intensity, which may be the point at which you return back. You strategically provide attention to that behavior. And the most powerful of that attention is obviously when we can praise the behavior that is the opposite of the one that we were ignoring. So tapping, making silly noises, the positive opposites to those would be leaving your things alone, would be listening quietly to the lesson, whatever it is that you want them to be doing instead. Almost like the moment, the point at which we see either that behavior or a close enough version of that behavior, we provide the attention back. We close the loop on the planned ignore. Because that way, yes, the child will learn that making a silly noise isn't enough to get my teacher's attention, but what does get my teacher's attention is when I'm doing X, Y, and Z expected behaviors. So that can make planned ignoring become more powerful as a teaching tool when the child it's made explicit to the child at what point the attention is returned to them. And so I know this is a huge ask in a classroom when there are so many things going on, keeping track of it. But that's something, once again, thinking about particular kids, thinking about the ones who are persistent, who don't seem to be learning from just your instinctual behavior management. This could be something that you could use to turn the dial up on your strategies for those types of children. Because I'm aware that this costs a lot in general in terms of energy and time. So yes, we want to do it to the target child, but it's also what we mentioned at the start, that idea of proximal praise, that can also be really useful as well, of finding the positive opposites in children close or around the other child as well. And so these are the types of, this is the sort of strategy, the planned ignoring coupled with praising the positive opposite that we might use for that attention-seeking, more non-disruptive, non-safety, rule-violating behaviours. What I will say is how important it is to be prepared for what we call in sort of the learning theory world as the extinction burst. And even if that phrase isn't familiar, the actual behavior is. It's when you start ignoring something and it escalates. It gets bigger, it gets louder, it gets more intense, which makes complete sense, because if a child is stuck in a cycle with an adult where these particular behaviors reliably bring their caregiver to them and talking to them and interacting with them, of course, our first instinct is to go, oh, it's not working. Hello, it's worked so often before, let's just make it more intense. And what often happens is that that's the point at which, I see it with parents all the time, once the kid escalates up, that's the point at which they turn around, their own limit is reached, they turn around and they intervene either by providing attention, scolding, whatever that looks like, which makes complete sense in the moment. You've reached your limit, and so the behaviors have reached that point at which it's like, this is no longer tolerable. But the message that it sends in terms of the learning experience to the child is that, okay, that's the point at which, that's where I need to start next time. If I just make it bigger, longer, louder, more intense, the need will eventually get met. So I'm going to start there next time or get there much more quickly next time. So that's why I say planned ignoring is one of the hardest things to do, because it's almost as if you have to go until the bitter end, which is why I think doing this combination with the praising the positive opposite sort of can make it feel as if you have more control over the situation, because you are monitoring for the point at which the behavior reaches that peak and then starts to de-escalate. And it doesn't have to de-escalate all the way. You can jump in. I have kids who, they'll be saying Georgie, 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 and they'll be standing right there, and then they'll stop saying it, and it'll be like 3 seconds of quiet. And I have a really low bar for praise for these kids, and so I'll then turn around and say, thank you so much for waiting patiently for me to finish speaking. And they've done 3 seconds of waiting, but that's I'm meeting them where they're at, and then the expectation as they get better at using their waiting muscles, for example, I can extend the period of time where I can allow them to wait patiently while I do something. So yes, that's sort of the 1-2 punch of the ignore and the returning of attention. I think is quite powerful. But we do need to wait until the behavior does start to de-escalate, so we don't reinforce it right at its height, thinking that that's the thing they should do next time, which it's very easy for me to sit here and say, much harder to do in person, I know. So what does it look like? I mean, it can be this extreme of like a really active planned ignore, like no eye contact, no speaking, physically turning away, like neutral expression. That's like level 3, right? But I think it can be much more subtle than that as well. So levels 1 and 2, level 1 might just be you refrain from mentioning, but you're still interacting with the child. But they say something, for example, to get a little bit of a reaction. They're a little bit cheeky, a little bit rude. A level 1 planned ignore might just be refrain from mentioning. You just carry on as if it didn't happen. You don't provide any oxygen to that fire. Most kids will quickly realize that's not going to be an effective strategy for them to get that reaction. They'll quickly sort of leave it by the wayside. Level 2 might be a little bit more extreme than that they do something and you sort of orient, you stop sort of speaking to them, but you're still oriented, you're still around them, but you may not just be directly engaging with them until that behavior stops, and then you're back. And then this level 3 might be a physically like disengaging with them altogether. So I guess it just depends on what the behavior is, how persistent the behavior is, what scope you have for ignoring or not. And I think always coming back to one of our take-home messages, I think, in these workshops is that what we might find reinforcing or punishing isn't necessarily the same for children. So even getting in trouble, any sort of emotional attention, whether that's if they're doing something wrong, that will often be frustration, anger, being annoyed, being scolded, being told, we do not do that, whatever. Keeping in mind that even that can be experienced as reinforcing if the function of the behavior is attention seeking. We're not always going to get it right because we're humans and we react to things, and particularly when we're tired or emotional or we're hungry, we're going to be more reactive, so we're not always going to get it right. I just want that on the record. But when we think about a particular interaction and trying to debrief it, it's something to consider whether your emotional reactions, even if it means getting the child in trouble, is actually serving to maintain that behavior. And if a calm planned ignore might be more effective over time for reducing that behavior. This sort of comes back to this idea of trying to praise the positive opposite, is that idea of this on-off switch, where planned ignoring is the attention switch being off, and as soon as you see something that's the positive opposite, or any appropriate behavior, honestly, giving attention to that, turning the switch back on. So that idea. A couple of examples here, sort of easy ones. Pounding behavior, tapping behavior. At what point can we find an opportunity to provide a label praise for any type of calm or quiet behavior? Talking behavior to the person next to you. Again, label praise for being quiet. Loud humming while reading. This is maybe one of those more subtle ones. Maybe we want to provide attention for the behavior that we actually do like, which is the reading as opposed to the humming. It would depend here, because this could just be a sensory seeking one. The humming, in which case, whether you were ignore or not, isn't going to impact the frequency of the behavior. That won't serve as a reinforcement or a punishment, because the function of the behavior is to have that sensory experience as opposed to getting attention. So we might need another strategy if the humming is that disruptive, to manage that. And ignoring may not have an effect on that if the function isn't to seek attention or get reaction. So keep that in mind. This is just for your records, or just in case it's helpful, of just getting a bit of inspiration about how we can find a positive opposite in some of these like classic domains of disruptive behavior. Because there's not always going to be this one-to-one, and in particular situations, the thing that is the thing that the child should be doing may change from situation to situation, right? So as we spoke about in the reward section, being as specific as possible with their behavior expectations is really helpful. And if we can find opportunities to praise those specific behaviors, once again, we're setting the kid up to know what's expected of them and what they're aiming for, I guess, what's going to get the positive reinforcement that they might be seeking.